My name is Paul Wolver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products, and this is my extended runtime fuel kit for generators that use the RATO, which is R-A-T-O 79.7 cc engine, which is a knockoff of the Yamaha EF2000 engine. But at any rate, the Power Horse 2000, the Predator 2000, the Wen 2000, the Wen 2250 all use this same engine. Don't allow the generator that I'm going to be working on to confuse you. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be shooting it on a Wen 2000. The Predator is going to be red, the Power Horse is going to be blue, and both of the Wens are going to be bright orange. Don't let that bother you. A couple of things I'd like to cover before we get started on this. Number one, the most common question I'm asked is people want to know is, can I still use the stock tank with your kit installed? Yes, absolutely. With all my kits, I try to add feature, not remove any of the original stock feature. Item number two, if you're watching this video on YouTube, please do not attempt to contact me through YouTube. I do not monitor YouTube comments or anything like that. I simply don't have the time. If you look in the description section of this video down below, you'll see that there is a link to contact me on my website. My website has an email address and my phone number, as well as a very good FAQ page. I've got the top 5 questions that people seem to always want to know the answer to, and they don't seem to go to the FAQ page for some reason. But at any rate, if you go to the website, you can contact me there. The first step will be to remove the cabinet, and the cabinet is very similar on all these. The Wen 2000, you simply remove the 3 screws at the top, and then the cabinet side will unsnap. My kits use a pulse pump. I'm often asked, why don't you use an electric fuel pump for them? Number one, most of the generators don't have the ability to power an electric fuel pump. It's like this particular generator here has a 12 volt output on it. However, that 12 volt output is half-wave rectified. So it will charge a battery, but it will not power a fuel pump, because instead of being, well, a 12 volt battery is really 13.85 volts, but instead of putting out a solid 14.5 volts DC, it's oscillating back and forth between about 17 volts and 19 volts, which will charge a battery, yes, but it won't run a fuel pump. So in order to run a fuel pump off of it, I would have to build an LC filter and then a battery, which is going to add to the cost and the complexity of the fuel kit, and that's why I use pulse pumps. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is, on some of the generators, they have an on-off switch, which is just a rocker switch for the ignition, and then the fuel selector valve for the fuel. And the neat thing about that is that if they are running the generator and they want to store it for a while, they leave the ignition turned on and they rotate the fuel switch to the off position. It will then run until it stalls out, and it runs most of the fuel out of the carburetor. The Predator 2000, Power Horse 2000, and Wen 2000 do not do that. They have a micro switch driven by a cam on the back of the fuel selector valve, so that when it is in the on position, the fuel is on and the spark is on, but as you turn it to the off position, at some point the fuel will shut off and it still has spark. And we need to find that point, because as I stated, item number one, it will allow you to move the knob to that position and run the fuel out of the float bowl. Item number two, with my fuel kit, it needs to be in that position so it shuts off the stock tank but pulls fuel from the remote tank and still has spark. So we need to determine exactly where the fuel stops flowing, but the spark is still there. So if you come around to the side and you look at the back of the fuel selector valve, this hose right here is the fuel coming out of the fuel selector valve and going into the carburetor. Now that's held on with a Corbin clamp. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this hose first, and then I'll show you how a Corbin clamp works. And there are several different styles of Corbin clamp, but you'll hear them referred to as spring clamps and so on. Okay, so what you would do is just squeeze in on these two ears. And when you squeeze on those two ears, the clamp gets bigger, and when you release, the clamp tightens around the fuel hose. So you'd squeeze those two ears in and pull the clamp off. So we're going to slide this hose off, and we'll get back to this hose later. But for right now, we need it in the off, hanging loose. And you look at the back of the fuel selector valve, and here's where the fuel is going to come out of. So we want to slowly turn the fuel selector knob on the front of the generator to the on position until we see fuel just barely starting to come out. And when we see fuel starting to come out, we'll turn it back just a little bit to the off position. So let's go ahead and turn it to where we see the fuel just starting to drip out. Okay, there it goes, and we're going to turn it back to the off position just a little bit. So now if you come around the front of the generator and you look at the fuel selector knob, here's the indicator on the knob, and it's about halfway between these two black gaps in this orange area. So you would need to mark that in a way that is very clear. And there is a little bit of leeway on these, where right here the fuel is off and it doesn't shut off the spark till it goes over here. So I'm going to put it just a little bit closer to the off position. Now you can use either a Sharpie marker, or in my case I'm going to use a piece of orange tape, because Wen uses orange markers on all of theirs. So that's going to be the new off for fuel. So now if you're doing a Predator or a Power Horse or a Wen 2000, you would have it in this position to run it off of my remote tank. And then whenever you wanted to shut the thing completely off, you would rotate it all the way to the off position. Okay? The next step is going to be to go ahead and remove the valve cover. And this is the valve cover over here. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the breather hose, and that's this black rubber hose that goes from the intake manifold to the valve cover. So we're going to take a pair of needle nose pliers and slide it off the valve cover, slide it out from behind the bracket on the casing, and we're going to set this hose aside. We are going to be reusing that later. The valve cover is held on by 4 bolts, one on each corner of the valve cover itself. So we'll remove these 4 bolts. And then we'll move the spark plug cap off the spark plug and just tuck it up out of the way. And we've just tucked it up above the fuel cap or the fuel tank. Now the valve cover itself is a little bit tricky to get out of here because it is so tight. What I do is I take 4 fingers and slide them right behind this brace and push my thumb against the end of the carburetor right where it bolts the intake manifold. And that allows me to pull the case out. What I do is I lift the valve cover up, slide it further in, and then up out of the top. Okay. You'll notice that I tore the valve cover taking it out because the valve cover stuck to the valve cover gasket is torn. And that's because the gasket stuck to the valve cover. If the gasket sticks to the cylinder head, it actually makes your job easier. My kit comes with a new valve cover gasket. The valve cover gasket that comes with a kit is a genuine Yamaha valve cover gasket. And that's because, as I stated earlier, the engine that they use is a knockoff of the Yamaha engine. So the Yamaha valve cover gasket works perfectly. The next thing that I'd like to go over is what we're going to do is disable the stock PCV valve. If you look through this hole, you'll see that there is a metal valve. It's just a thin wafer of metal. It's a reed valve. So air and fuel will go out, or excuse me, air and oil will go out through that, but they won't come back in. Now some of the engines do not have a PCV valve. Here's the same valve cover gasket, or excuse me, same valve cover, but it is not the polished finish, and I would describe that as a rough or porous or sand cast finish. Typically, the ones with the sand cast valve cover do not have a valve or PCV valve in it. If you look, there's a piece of screen in there. Also, the breather plate is riveted in instead of held in with screws. If yours has no PCV valve, you'll put it back on. I do not have serial numbers to identify them with or anything else. I've been trying to get some information from the manufacturers as to which engines have a PCV valve and which ones do not. There's no rhyme or reason behind it. I can't tell if it's a late model or an early model that they switched, or if it's a vendor issue. But at any rate, so our first step is going to be to disable the PCV valve. To do that, you'll remove the 3 Phillips head screws. And this is the breather plate. Let me get a small screwdriver. This little wafer of metal, and I'm going to push on the back of it, is the reed valve. As you can see, when it's in the open position like this, air will flow both directions. So we need to disable the stock PCV valve, and my kit comes with an external PCV valve that we'll be installing later. Easiest way to disable the PCV valve is just to push it up from the bottom and then get a hold of it with a pair of needle nose pliers and bend the reed valve and the reed valve stop back just ever so slightly, so that what you're doing is you're putting a kink in that stock PCV valve so that it stays open. Okay. Now you'll see that the valve itself is staying open. I can slide a screwdriver there from the back. So now the valve is staying in the open position, so it functions just like this one, which has no valve whatsoever in it. And now we'll go ahead and bolt the breather plate back in. Let me tear this piece of the old valve cover gasket out of the way first. Do not put gasket sealant on this gasket right here, because there are two little oil return areas on this, and if you put gasket sealer in there, you'll plug up the oil return areas. And as I stated earlier, air and oil will be blasted through this hole as the engine is running, and you want the oil to scavenge or return back into the crankcases. So don't put gasket sealant in there, otherwise the oil returns will be blocked. Put the screws in loose at first, and then once you've got all the screws started, go ahead and snug them back down. I'm going to take a razor blade and clean the gasket that we tore off the surface here. As I stated, the kit will come with a new valve cover gasket. And as I stated when you took it off, it's just a whole lot easier for you if you put the valve cover gasket onto the cylinder head first, because it won't stick to the valve cover and it'll fall off and you'll be likely to tear it. So right now I'm just making sure that the valve cover gasket is sitting all the way down in there. Okay. So now what we're going to do is the opposite of the way we got it out. We're going to fit it in through the top and then put our fingers behind this and pry out on this so that we can get it down into place exactly where it goes. There's a little rubber flap here that may hang up and hold your valve cover up out of the way. So once you've got the valve cover dropped into place, make sure that all the bolt holes line up correctly. It should be a straight shot through the valve cover gasket, and into the threads of the cylinder head area. If you see a valve cover gasket overlapping that hole, that means you've kinked the valve cover gasket or something in the process. And you definitely don't want to kink the valve cover in the process, or the valve cover gasket in the process, because then it'll leak. So now you go ahead and put the 4 bolts back in their respective locations. And then once you get them all in all the way, go ahead and snug them down. Okay. Now, included in the kit is going to be the replacement PCV valve, as well as the other items. Incidentally, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I forgot. Included in the kit is a flash drive with a copy of the video you're working on or watching right now. So you will get a copy of these instructions with it, and you can also watch the video on my website. Please do not attempt to install this kit from YouTube videos, because if you get the wrong video on YouTube, you're going to possibly drill a hole in the wrong place or something like that, and then you're going to call me up going, what do I do now? So don't try to find the right video on YouTube. Either take the video off of my website or use the video on the flash drive. Okay. So you'll take one of the clamps that is included in the kit. The PCV valve, this end of it is going to go on to the valve cover where this end used to go. There's a little port on the valve cover that we just removed. And here's the other valve cover that I was looking at or showing you earlier, but it goes on to this port right here. But only it's on the engine. So we're going to install it on this port, on the one on the engine. And to do that, you pull out on it just a little bit, take a pair of needle nose pliers, if need be, to guide this up onto that port. I'd like you to notice that on that port on the valve cover, there is no hose barb. It's straight. So that's why, even though this hose only carries air, we're going to put a hose clamp on this one too. Incidentally, these hose clamps work like this. You squeeze them together and they stay there. If you need to remove one of the hose clamps, take a pair of pliers on one side and twist. And now you can reuse it. And this is a fairly tight fit. just squeezing the clamp down right now. Get a little bit of light on that so I can see behind it. Okay. Okay. We want to make sure that the hose is bottomed out against the valve cover and that the clamp is back about 1 millimeter from the end of the hose, because you don't want the clamp to slide off the end of the hose. And you'll see right here there's a recessed area that just barely big enough for that hose and clamp to go into. So now if you look at it, the clasp to the clamp point down at this angle, and that's the best way to get that clamp on there. Now your PCV valve sticks out here, and your pulse line, which goes to the fuel pump that we'll be installing later, is going to hang down here, and we're going to trim it to fit onto the fuel pump a little later. Right now, you'll take the stock hose that I said you'd be reusing later, and you'll slide it onto the port on the intake manifold and hold it up into place and see where it needs to be trimmed. And you're going to cut it right here and put it onto the new PCV valve. And it's always better to cut it a little too long here, because you can always shorten it. But if you cut it too short, you can't lengthen it. Okay, I cut it a little bit too long, which causes it to be a sharper bend here. But when I run my finger inside it, it's not kinked on the inside of this bend. Okay, I went back and reviewed the video that we shot so far, and I made an error in what I stated when I was talking about why I don't use electric fuel pumps, because the 12-volt output on this is only halfway rectified. I said it oscillates between 17 and 19 volts. I should have said 7 volts and 19 volts. If you look at it with a voltmeter, it'll show approximately 14 volts, but if you look at it on an oscilloscope, you'll see it's pulsating, which will charge a battery, but it will not run a fuel pump. Okay, back to this. So we've got the hose that we just cut, put onto the PCV valve, or from the PCV valve to the manifold, and you want to make sure that it's not kinked flat. And if you feel it here, it's a nice radius bend. The thing you want to look at now is, if you look behind it, you'll see where the choke mechanism is, and if you turn the fuel selector valve all the way to the start position, the choke will pull closed, and then when you would put it back to the run position, you want to make sure that this wire or the choke mechanism doesn't hit the hose and hold the choke partially closed. So if you look at this, and I don't know if you can get a clear view on it without a flashlight or not, but it does not hit the PCV valve. That's one of those misses as good as a mile. So we've got the PCV valve in place. The fuel pump is going to mount right here, and we'll be drilling a hole here later on. The port closest to the gold screen is the pulse port, and that's what powers the fuel pump. This port is fuel into the pump, and this port is fuel out. Okay, the kit is going to come with a section of 1/4-inch hose, and you will cut it into the appropriate lengths. So you will take the fuel filter, and on the input side of the filter, which is fuel flows in this direction, so it goes in this way and comes out this way. So on the input side of the fuel filter, you will take and put the 13-inch section of hose that you had cut off. On the output side of the fuel filter, you'll put a 3-inch section of hose that you've cut from the original hose section. Then on the 3-inch section of hose, you'll put the T-fitting. Not on the stem of the T-fitting, but on one of the branches of the T-fitting. Then on the stem of the T-fitting, you're going to put a hose that you've cut to 15 inches long. So it'll look like this. You've got a 13-inch, 3-inch, and a 15-inch. I'm not putting any hose clamps on yet because once we fit this all in, we may have to trim the lengths of the hose, and if we have to do any adjustment, it's easier to do it without the hose clamps in place. So now we're going to come over here, and this is the hose that you originally removed from the fuel selector valve. This end went on the fuel selector valve, the other end goes to the carburetor, and we're going to depress the Corbin clamp, move it off, and then we'll pull this hose off the carburetor. You'll notice that this end of the hose is 1/4 inch and this end is 3/16. In an earlier video that I did a couple years ago, somebody commented and claimed that I was using the wrong size hose because I put a 3/16 in one place and a 1/4 in the other, and that's because the original formed hose is formed to 1/4 on one end and 3/16 on the other end. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. I don't make mistakes like that. Okay. So then you'll take the hose that we just made up, you'll run the 13-inch piece behind this bar and then go over between the blower housing and the fuel pump, and it'll come out on the other side right over the valve cover that we disabled the PCV valve in. The 15-inch section you'll run over to the other side and it'll come out right in front of the air box, or just above the air box and in front of the intake manifold. You'll run in front of the choke cable because you don't want the choke cable to be bent around in a hard loop. So if you come around here, this is the 13-inch section that we pass between the fuel pump, or the fuel tank, and the blower housing. And this is the 15-inch section that went in front of the manifold. And it's going to tuck in here and connect to the input side of the fuel pump. This is going to go into the input fitting in the top of the generator. Here is the actual pump that we're going to be putting on. When you remove the pump from the bag, you'll notice that there are covers over 2 of the ports. Remove those covers before you put the fuel pump on. And as I stated earlier, the port by the gold fitting is the pulse port, and that's where the pulse line will go onto it. This fitting is fuel in, and this fitting is fuel out. So the fuel in is this hose here. And I'm going to trim it about 2 inches, and I'll show you why when we get around to the other side. And that's why we're not putting hose clamps on it till we get everything fitted. Now if you come around this side here, you'll see that this is the hose that we just put in place. And it runs around in a nice smooth arc. Now we're going to take the stock hose. This end is 1/4 inch, so that's going to go on to our 1/4 inch T-fitting. And we're going to use the stock Corbin clamp because this hose is a smaller diameter on the outside. It's not nearly as thick a wall as my hoses. We're going to trim the hose to the right length to where it can go on to the back of the fuel selector valve where it originally went. And I'm going to cut it a little longer than I think it should be because I can always shorten it if it's too long, but it's impossible to lengthen it if you accidentally cut it too short. So I'm going to cut it right here, and then I'm going to use the stock Corbin clamp, and I'll go ahead and slide this onto the port for the fuel selector valve. Let's see how that looks. Okay. The hose is just a little bit too long. I don't like this kink here. So I'm going to shorten it about 1/2 inch. I don't know if you need to use a flashlight or if you can see that that's right back onto the port where it was originally at. And now we'll take and slide our Corbin clamp up into place. I'm just sliding this outer hose. If you'll notice, the original stock hose has a couple of strain reliefs or wear areas on them, and I'm sliding this back to where if this does touch that metal bracket, that it'll ride against the wear piece. Okay. This hose that was originally on the PCV valve that we installed as part of the kit will go on to, and I've got a separate fuel pump sitting here so I can show you because you can't see that one real clearly, but that's going to go on to this port. And keep in mind that it's mounted in this manner, so this port is the one next to the gold screen, and that's the pulse port. And we'll go ahead and trim that the appropriate length. And we may end up trimming it shorter. I'm going to trim it just a little longer than what I think it needs to be, so that if I do have to trim it, it's okay, because you can't lengthen it. And what I want to do is make sure that this hose here bends in a nice smooth bend. I don't want it kinked. And I'm going to say that that needs to be about 1 inch shorter. I think when I trimmed this other hose, I may have dropped a fitting, or excuse me, a section of the hose down inside. No, I did not. It hit the floor. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the pulse line and put it onto the port that goes where the gold screen is. Get just a little bit of oil. If you don't have a little cap with oil in it, you can always take the dipstick and put some oil on the hose with that. It's a lot easier to get them onto the fittings. We got just a little bit of oil on the hoses. Okay, I just want to make sure that that hose isn't kinked. I don't know if I stated this earlier or not, but right where I made this black dot, we're going to drill a 1/4 inch hole, and that's where we're going to bolt the fuel pump in place when we're done. Okay. That feels good there. We're going to take the remaining section of the hose that came in the kit. We're going to run it under the air box and it'll come out just in front of the air box and go up to the input on the carburetor. I don't know if you can see it clearly. Here the hose is now. So we've run it from the area over by the fuel pump, down under the air box, and back up into a loop. Now if we go around the other side, we'll be able to see clearly to be able to put it onto the line where we removed this hose from on the carburetor. So now if you look in there, you can see that that hose right here is hooked onto the bottom of the port on the carburetor where we originally removed the stock fuel line from. Okay, we're ready to go ahead and start putting hose clamps on, and I'm going to start with the most difficult one, which is the one that goes to the back side of the carburetor. I have not hooked this end yet because I'm going to trim it to the appropriate length once I start getting the rest of them clamped up. So what I'm doing is putting this hose clamp around the hose, and then I'm going to snap it to where it just barely engages, and I'll show you on a piece of hose that's out first. Okay. So here's a piece of hose the size of what I'm using. What I did was I reached in there and put the hose clamp around the hose like this, and then I squeezed it a couple of clicks by hand. Then I'll slide it up over the barb and squeeze it down with a pair of pliers. Getting it engaged just a couple of clicks by hand makes it a lot easier. I don't know if you can see clearly from there what I'm doing or not. So what happens is when you squeeze the hose clamps in place, that one went fairly straight, but sometimes they will be off-centered like that. And what you do is you come back and side to side, squeeze on it with a pair of pliers to center it up. And that's what I had to do on this one. So now the hose clamp is in the appropriate position. It may be easier for you to see it with the camera from this side, I don't know. You'll know if I've got too much light in there or not. Okay, that actually looks pretty good. I'm now going to go ahead and put hose clamps on this hose. The kit comes with plenty of hose clamps. In fact, it has enough hose clamps to put on all the fittings for the PCV line. But when we get back over to the other side, you'll see just how tight that PCV line is. And keep in mind that that just carries air, not fuel. So it being as difficult as it is to get at, and the fact that it's carrying air, it's not critical if, or excuse me, it's not dangerous to have a leak. It would leak air, not gasoline. next thing we want to do is just make sure that none of the hoses are kinked at a sharp angle and that they're all laying where you get a nice smooth radius flow. Everything on that side looks good. The fuel pump is in the appropriate location. Remember, we're going to drill a hole here and use the bolt that's included in the kit to mount the fuel pump in place. So now we have hose clamps on the fuel input line to the pump and to the pulse line to the pump. Now what I'm going to do is come over to the other side, and you see this hose. I'm going to put a zip tie around the spigot from the fuel tank to this hose, and all that's going to do is hold it up just a little bit so that it doesn't come anywhere near the recoil start rope. During the normal operation of the generator, it is possible for that recoil start rope to cut through the fuel line if they touch. And we're not trying to zip tie it up tight against it. We just want it to support it just a little bit. Okay, so now if you look, there's no way that this recoil rope, because the recoil start handle is right here, so the recoil rope is going to come out basically the same angle as my finger is. It's not going to come anywhere near this fuel hose. Okay. This is the fuel hose that goes to the output port on the pump and around and to the carburetor, which we put on earlier. So we're just going to mark the approximate length of that. And snip it off. And as you remember, we've been cutting everything just slightly longer, and that's why we had that 3-inch section to cut off there. A little bit of oil on that spigot of the pump. Which makes it a lot easier to put this hose on. That there. And now we'll go ahead and drill our 1/4-inch hole right here. included in the kit is a 3/4 inch bolt with a flat washer and a nut. Just rotating that clamp out of the way just slightly to give it a little bit more room to work. So keep in mind that all we're trying to do with this bolt is just keep the fuel pump kind of in place. It is a lightweight fuel pump and just a couple of hoses going to it. If you crank down on this bolt too much, you're going to wind up mushrooming the plastic out of place. Okay, so now what we're going to do is mount our input fitting. And if you notice, there's a little plug here that the spark plug is accessed or serviced through. We're going to go 3/4 of an inch diagonally toward this handle, which is going to put it about halfway between the spark plug access and the handle. Now on some of these generators, specifically the Win 2250, there's webbing in here, so you want to stick your finger in there and feel exactly where the webbing is. On this particular model generator, there is no webbing, and you don't want to hit the webbing. You'd want to find a pocket between the webbing. I don't want to go all the way in with the step drill because I don't want to inadvertently drill the hole too big. So from here, I'm going to take a repairman's reamer and clean it up just a slight bit. This is one of the fuel fittings that's included in the kit. And what you're going to do is you're going to screw the hose barb down to the fuel fitting, and it'll create a pinch point between these two. It's going to kind of pinch down on the plastic housing. In order to make sure it's a good seal between the threads, I'm going to use Teflon tape included in the kit and wrap the Teflon tape around the threads. Be very careful when you wrap the Teflon tape. Do not overlap the end like that, because what it'll do is it'll shear that piece off when you're tightening the threads down. Truth be known, that will get caught in the fuel filter, so it won't do any damage, but it will clog up the filter a little bit earlier than normal. So we'd prefer not to have that happen. When this comes down tight, we're going to try and set it to where the prongs point forward. That way when the fuel hose snaps on, the fuel hose runs down the front of the generator, because we don't want the fuel hose running down the back of the generator where the hot exhaust is, for obvious reasons. Okay, tighten that down just a little bit more. Okay, now we can put our spark plug axis back in place. And now we're going to take this hose, the last one, and we're going to mark it where we think it'll end up at and cut it. And I'm going to cut it just a little bit too long and then double check it. It's always easier to shorten it a little bit than it is to lengthen it. Okay, that I like. So I'm going to take just a little bit more oil, put it on that hose barb, so I can slide that hose back up on there more easily. Okay. we can take the spark plug cap that we removed when we pulled the valve cover off earlier and go ahead and snap it back onto the spark plug. Okay. Now we go ahead and put the covers back on. Take one last look at it, make sure that there's nothing that's going to get in the way or cause any problems. The covers go on the opposite as the way they came off. There are 3 little hooks that slide in at the bottom, and in the latches which snap on, and then the 3 screws at the top. This side does the same exact thing. Last step for the installation is an instruction decal. Put it anywhere where it's clearly visible. I'm going to put it right up here. That way people can see it from the top because they're going to be running this generator most likely sitting on the ground. But you can put it on the side or anything you want. Incidentally, step 7 on this decal is not a misprint. That's where it tells you to move the fuel selector valve to the off position in order to run. And as you remember earlier, when we made this mark on the fuel selector valve, you would now line up the index mark on the fuel selector valve with the new line that you put, and that's going to be the remote tank position. This would be the stock tank position, and of course this would shut the engine off immediately. If you have any questions about this, please go to my website. There is a link to the website just below this video in the description section. If you go to my website, it's got my email address and my phone number and a complete description of the product and how to operate it, as well as a product demo video that shows you how to run the generator. Please do not attempt to contact me through YouTube. I do not monitor YouTube comments or any of the chat rooms. I simply don't have time. If you're looking to contact me, either phone call or email. One last thing here is the kit also comes with another quick disconnect port, and that'll go in your remote tank and in a Yamaha fuel hose with quick disconnect fittings on both ends of them. And that should about do it. I thank you for your time.